Freddy, have I ever told you about my days at Studio 54? I used to light up the disco with my presence. You would have been very impressed. I know it was well before your time, but nevertheless, it was a time immortal. So I decided we should commemorate that golden era with a 21st century disco ball. Yes, a disco ball. Wait, Freddy, get back here. I promise you, you'll love this. Welcome to Blending with Algernon. I am your host, Sir Algernon, Blender Instructor Extraordinaire. And this is my faithful companion, Freddy. Let's do the hustle and crank up Blender. We're working in version 4.3.2. Here is our startup scene with that infamous default cube. Send it to the cornfield, Freddy. Thank you. All right, let's start geo-noodling. Split our window and switch the bottom half to geometry nodes. You can use the layout tab at the top if you wish, but the default geometry nodes layout includes that nefarious spreadsheet window that's of no use to me at the moment. Create a plane to which we shall attach our geometry nodes modifier. As you can see in our modifier window, there is no modifier yet, but when you press New in the GeoNode window, a modifier pops up. Perfect. Delete the group input node, as we will be creating our own new primitive. The plane geometry was just a ruse. In its place, an icosphere. I like saying that word, Freddy. Icosphere. So satisfying, Attach the icosphere node to the group output, and poof, an icosphere appears. Next, let's create a wireframe around our new icosphere. While we could create one with the wireframe modifier, it will not allow us the control we will need. So let's create a mesh to curve and a curve to mesh pair of nodes. Attach, and voila, we have a wireframe. But as my first ex-wife used to say to me, you lack depth. We need to add an additional curve to the profile curve to attain the substance we require. A circle curve should do the trick. Attach, and we have a soccer ball. Not what we want. Easily corrected by adjusting the radius to, say, 0.005. Yes, it's starting to look like a disco ball already, don't you think, Freddy? Let's bring back the original icosphere by creating a join geometry node and attaching our old mesh and our new wireframe mesh to it. Very nice, but like belligerent third graders, we need separation. We can achieve this with a very powerful node, the transform node. Unlike the wireframe modifier we could have used in our modifier stack, the transform node gives us quite a bit of control. Let's adjust the scale to approximately 2.5 along X, Y, and Z. These wireframes do not a prison make, nor curved meshes a cage, right, Freddy? I digress. Next, let's give our centerpiece a bit more character. I feel cubes would be best suited for the task. Create an instance on points node from our curve to mesh node. Then a cube primitive to the instance plug. Join it all up and character flourishes, yes? It feels a bit too square, so let's adjust the size of the cubes a bit. Around a 0.7 should do it. Now we need something to fill the space between the center and the wireframe. Let's duplicate the instance on points node and pull a connection from curves to mesh into it. Let's join it to the rest and replace the cube instance with another icosphere. Plug the output of those new instances to the group output so we can isolate them and see what we've got. A cabbage. No, that won't do. Let's adjust the radius to a 0.05. Better. All right, now rejoin everything. The new instances are being overrun by our centerpiece. We'll have to scale them out some. Transform geometry to the rescue. A scale of 2 should do the trick. Yes, that's looking lovely. We now have 3 distinct elements to our disco ball. It's time to add some color, but first, Freddy, let's organize a bit. As our GeoNode system becomes bigger, it can become confusing to see what's what and what's where. Select our nodes and press Ctrl-J to frame them together. F2 will allow us to name the selection. Relevant names for relevant groups, right, Freddy? Let's switch over to the shaders, but first, before I forget, let's make sure we are in Eevee. Good. While we're here in our render panel, let's tick ray tracing and motion blur. Now let's create some materials. We'll need 3, 1 for the center blocks, 1 for the wireframe, and 1 for our satellites. Name accordingly so we can reference them in GeoNodes. Let's switch back to the Geometry Nodes panel for a moment and set the materials in our flow. The Set Material node is what we need. Connect and reference the correct material within the node. Do this for each of our 3 disco elements. Well done. Back to the shader editor and switch to the render view. The default materials are rather bleak. No worries. We shall correct. Let's start with the center blocks. Since our goal with the center blocks was to give it some character, let's slap on some more. Set the base color to a subtle pale bluish and lower the roughness to shine it up. Next, let's throw an emission shader into the mix. Set that to a deep blue. A mix shader to combine, and then a Voronoi texture for the factor. Voronoi. That's another satisfying word to say, don't you think, Freddy? Voronoi. It doesn't have the same punch as Icosphere, but it does have its own romantic suavity. So the Voronoi texture needs a color ramp for some control. Color ramp to factor. And our center blocks look sick. And I don't mean that in the modern sense. Freddy, fiddle with the scale on the texture and the sliders on the color ramp a bit. Better. I can work with that. Onto the wireframe material. Let's set the base color to a similar pale blue as the blocks and increase the metallic setting a good bit. Add a mix shader and duplicate the color node. Set the base color of the second node to a deep blue and connect. We will combine these 2 colors with another texture, but not a Voronoi texture. Instead, a wave texture. That, of course, will go through a color ramp for control. Bring the black and white sliders close together and towards the center. This will give us a nice contrast between the colors. Adjust the scale on the texture, and let's zoom in to see what we've got. It's a bit difficult to see at the moment, but it will be clear once we add our lights. But first, let's finish up the last material, the one for our satellites. Let's contrast a bit with a deep red this time. Increase the metallic to 1 and decrease the roughness to 0. When the lights hit these, we want them to shimmer like the police lights of a disco. Moving on. Lights. Yes, let there be lights. Create an area light and move it directly above our ball. Adjust the power to around 200 and set the color to our familiar pale blue. Also, let's make it a bit smaller, around 0.25 meters. Switch to a top view, and while still selected, Alt-D to make a copy. Bring that new light off to the side a bit. Repeat this process until we have a total of 9 lights in a 3x3 configuration above our ball. By Alt-D clicking on the lights, we are creating identical instances of the lights, which will allow us to propagate any changes to all the copies. Let's duplicate our 9 lights and create a new set of 9 lights. Move these below our ball and rotate along the x-axis 180 degrees so that they point straight up. All right, it's time for a camera. Create one and place it out in front of our disco ball along the y-axis. Let's split our view so we can have one for the camera view and one to move about our project. Number pad 0 to view through our newly created camera. Adjust our camera to be centered on our ball. Let's make this window a bit bigger and switch to rendered view. A bit bigger, please, Freddy. Thank you. While we still have the camera selected, let's go down to the viewport display settings and crank up the passepartout to 1. I can't stand seeing the bits outside our camera view. It causes me vertigo. Let's change the focal length so we can see our entire disco ball. 24 millimeters should do nicely. Next, let's change our world settings. Set the background to full black and let's add a principled volume so our lights haze up the scene a touch. The density should be around 0.005. Any more than that, and we won't be able to see much of anything. It's starting to look good, Freddy. With our lights in place, we can see the contrast on the wireframe nicely. Once we get a bloom going, those colors will pop. So let's get to it. Let's switch to a compositor node tree in the bottom window. Then tick the Use Nodes box along the top. Create a glare node. Connect and change to bloom. Set the quality to high and no change. Why? Because we need to change a setting in the viewport shading. Under Compositor, select Always. I like it, Freddy. I like it. But we can do better. Let's duplicate the glare node and set it to Ghosts. Now we need a key light to beam on our center blocks. Create another area light and drag it out in front of the ball. Rotate it along the x-axis and point it straight at our ball. Scale it up to about 2.4 meters and change the color to a deep red. It's still lacking the contrast I'm looking for, but we can adjust. In the render settings for our project, go to the color management section and change the look to a very high contrast. Also, change the view transform to a filmic. There. That's more like it. But our center blocks look like an iceberg. We shall correct. Let's go back to the shader editor and switch over to the blocks material. In our principled BSDF, set the metallic setting to 1. Much, much better. Yes, indeed, much better. All right, time to animate. Switch back to the Geometry Nodes editor. Let's add some rotation to our elements. Wireframe first. Create a transform geometry node and place it after the set material node. Let's create some keyframes in our timeline for the rotation. Move the playhead to the beginning and press the left arrow key once to move it to 0. In the transform geometry node we created, hover over the Z rotation and press I to create the keyframe. Move our playhead to the end. Set the Z rotation to 360 degrees and press the I key once again to key it. Play and let's see. Far too fast, Freddy. Let's slow things down. In the timeline, Set the end frames to 1000. Delete the keyframe we had at 250 and create a new one at 1000. Much better. Now let's create the rotation for our blocks. Duplicate the transform geometry node and place it after the set material for the blocks. As before, rewind the playhead, left arrow to 0 and keyframe away. However, this time from 360 degrees to 0, so the blocks rotate in the opposite direction. Lovely. Now the satellites, but let's rotate them along the x-axis for fun. So duplicate and keyframe along x. Marvelous. I'm almost ready to get my dancing shoes, Freddy. Just one last thing before we dance the night away. I'd like to animate the contrasting colors along the face of the blocks. So back to the shader editor and switch to the blocks material. In our Voronoi texture, there's that word again, Voronoi. Let's keyframe the scale from 0 to 3 across our 1000 frames. Then, duplicate and reverse the keyframes, as we did with our rotations. Add a mix node for the 2 texture nodes and connect the result to the color ramp. Let's keyframe the factor from 0 to 1 across our frames. This will combine our opposite texture scales to create a seamless loop. Good job, Freddy. Now output to the format of your choice and we're ready to boogie. This has been Blending with Algernon. Thank you for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing. Also, please share your creations with us. You can never have enough disco balls. All right, Freddy, let's get on that dance floor.